Everyone in the courtroom laughed when the mistress pointed at the wife's worn-out cardigan and whispered, "She looks like the cleaning lady, not the wife of a CEO." Jessica sat there, head bowed, clutching a plastic bag instead of a designer purse, while her husband Mark smirked. He thought he had won. He thought he was stripping her of everything. But Mark forgot one thing. He never actually asked who Jessica's father was. He was about to find out that the simple woman he cheated on was the only reason he wasn't bankrupt. Watch what happens when the courtroom doors open and the man who owns half the city walks in to defend his little girl. The air in courtroom 4B of the Seattle Superior Court was stale, smelling faintly of floor wax and old desperation. But on the left side of the aisle, the scent was overwhelmingly expensive, a mixture of custom-blended cologne and the sharp, crisp smell of new money. Mark Vance sat there, leaning back in his chair, with the casual arrogance of a man who had already calculated his victory. At 34, Mark was the CEO of Vance Logistics, a tech-shipping hybrid company that had skyrocketed in value over the last 5 years. He wore a bespoke Italian suit, navy blue, cut sharp, to accentuate his gym-honed physique. He tapped a gold fountain pen against the mahogany table, looking bored. Beside him sat his attorney, Samuel Henderson. Henderson was a shark in a 3-piece suit, known in the city for 2 things: getting wealthy men out of tight spots and destroying the reputations of the women who dared to divorce them. On the other side of the aisle, the contrast was so stark, it was painful to watch. Jessica Vance sat alone, save for her court-appointed representative, a tired-looking woman named Sarah Jenkins, who was shuffling through papers with a frown. Jessica didn't look like a CEO's wife. She looked like a ghost. She wore a beige wool cardigan that had seen better days, a simple grey skirt that fell below her knees, and flat shoes. Her hair, a mousy brown, was pulled back in a severe, messy bun. She wore no makeup. Her hands were folded in her lap, trembling slightly. But the real spectacle wasn't Mark or Jessica. It was the woman sitting in the front row of the public gallery, directly behind Mark. Jessica Thorne. Jessica was the reason for the proceedings, though Mark's lawyer would argue irreconcilable differences. Jessica was 24, a former Instagram model turned brand ambassador for Mark's company. She was dressed in a white pantsuit that cost more than Jessica's car, if Jessica had one. Her blonde hair was blown out to perfection. Her lips painted a glossy, predatory red. She wasn't trying to hide. She was marking her territory. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. Judge Harriet Miller swept into the room. She was a stern woman with steel-grey hair and a reputation for zero tolerance for theatrics. She sat down, adjusted her glasses, and looked at the docket. Case number 420, Vance v. Vance. Judge Miller read, "We are here to settle the division of assets and spousal support. Mr. Henderson, you may begin." Henderson stood up, buttoning his jacket. He gave Jessica a pitying look before addressing the judge. "Your Honor," Henderson began, his voice smooth as oil, "we intend to show that Mrs. Vance is not entitled to the 50% share of Vance Logistics she is requesting. In fact, we argue that she is entitled to very little." "On what grounds?" Judge Miller asked, peering over her spectacles. "On the grounds of contribution, or lack thereof," Henderson said, gesturing broadly at Mark. "Mr. Vance built this company from the ground up. He worked 18-hour days. He took the risks. He secured the capital. Mrs. Vance, well, she stayed home." Staying home is a contribution, Mr. Henderson, Judge Miller noted dryly. Especially if she managed the household. Henderson chuckled, a low, insulting sound. Managed, Your Honor. The couple has no children. They had a housekeeper. Mrs. Vance spent her days gardening and reading paperbacks. She brought no social capital to the marriage, no financial assets, and frankly her refusal to participate in Mr. Vance's corporate life was a hindrance to his business. She was a weight he had to drag uphill. Mark nodded solemnly, looking the part of the long-suffering genius. Jessica didn't look up. She just stared at the grain of the wood on the table. We are offering a one-time settlement of $50,000, Henderson concluded, which is generous considering she came into this marriage with nothing but a suitcase of thrift store clothes. Sarah Jenkins, Jessica's lawyer, stood up. Your Honor, this is absurd. Washington is a community property state. Mrs. Vance supported her husband for 2 years while he was developing his software. She paid the rent. She bought the groceries. With money she made as a librarian assistant. Henderson scoffed. Pennies, Your Honor. Irrelevant compared to the millions Mr. Vance generates now. The cruelty was the point. They wanted to crush her spirit so she would sign the paper and vanish. The proceedings dragged on for an hour. Mark's team presented charts and graphs showing the company's growth, conveniently omitting the seed funding that had mysteriously appeared in the early days. They painted Jessica as a depressive antisocial recluse who embarrassed Mark at company galas. During a short recess, the judge retreated to her chambers. The lawyers stepped out into the hallway to confer, leaving Mark, Jessica in the courtroom, with the bailiff who was scrolling on his phone near the door. This was the moment Jessica had been waiting for. She stood up and walked past the wooden railing approaching the defense table, where Jessica sat alone. Mark didn't stop her. He watched with an amused glint in his eyes. You know, Jessica said, her voice loud enough to echo in the quiet room. You really should just take the 50 grand, Ellie. Jessica slowly raised her head. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Please leave me alone, Jessica. Jessica laughed. She leaned against the table, flashing a massive diamond ring, a ring Mark had bought her 3 months ago, technically with marital funds. Look at you. Jessica sneered, gesturing up and down at Jessica's beige cardigan. You're pathetic. Mark tells me you buy your clothes at Walmart. Is that true, God? It smells like mothballs over here. I live simply, Jessica said softly. There is no shame in that. There is when your husband is a multi-millionaire, Jessica shot back. You embarrassed him, Ellie. Every time he took you to a dinner, people thought you were the help. You don't know how to dress. You don't know how to talk to important people. And you certainly don't know how to keep a man happy. Jessica leaned in closer, her perfume cloying and sweet. I'm doing you a favor. Take the money. Go move back to wherever you came from. Kansas, Idaho. Go buy a trailer and some cats, because you don't belong in our world. You're a mouse in a room full of lions. Mark chuckled from his seat. She's right, Elle. Don't drag this out. You can't afford a real lawyer. Jenkins is barely awake over there. Just sign the deal and I won't sue you for legal fees. Jessica looked at her husband. For the first time all day, a spark of something other than sadness appeared in her eyes. It looked like pity. I didn't want your money, Mark, Jessica whispered. I just wanted you to be the man you promised you were. The man I am? Mark snapped, his ego bruised by her tone. Is a man who outgrew you 10 years ago. I built Vance Logistics. Me. Alone. You're just a leech trying to get a payout. Simplicity isn't stupidity, Mark, Jessica said, her voice steadying. Jessica rolled her eyes. "Oh, spare us the philosophy lesson, Grandma. You're broke, you're boring, and you're done." At that moment, the side door opened. Sarah Jenkins. Jessica's lawyer walked back in, but she wasn't alone. Following her was a young associate carrying a heavy box of files, and behind him, nothing happened yet. The atmosphere remained tense. "Recess is over," the bailiff announced as Judge Miller returned to the bench. "Mrs. Jenkins," Judge Miller said, "do you have any witnesses or evidence to present to counter Mr. Henderson's claims?" Sarah Jenkins stood up. She looked different. She wasn't slouching anymore. She checked her watch, then looked at the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. "Actually, Your Honor," Sarah said, a small smile playing on her lips, "we do have one witness regarding the financial origins of Vance Logistics. We were just waiting for his flight to land." "Who is the witness?" Henderson demanded, annoyed. "We weren't notified of any surprise witnesses." "He's not just a witness," Sarah said. "He is a primary stakeholder." Jessica whispered loudly to Mark. "Who is she talking about? You own 100% of the shares." "I do," Mark whispered back, frowning. "She's bluffing." "Call your witness," Judge Miller said, checking the clock. Sarah Jenkins turned to the back of the room. "The defense calls Arthur Sterling." The name hung in the air for a second, not registering with everyone immediately. Mark frowned. He knew the name Sterling. Everyone in business knew the name Sterling. Sterling Global was a conglomerate that owned real estate, shipping lanes, and tech firms across 3 continents. Arthur Sterling was a ghost, a billionaire recluse who rarely left his estate in the Hamptons. Arthur Sterling. Mark laughed nervously. "What is this, a joke? Why would Arthur Sterling be here?" Jessica looked confused. "Who is that?" He's a billionaire," Mark hissed. "Like a real billionaire, not like me." Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The room went silent. 2 large men in black suits entered, first private security. They scanned the room and stepped aside. Then an older man walked in. He was in his late 60s, with silver hair swept back and a beard that was neatly trimmed. He wore a charcoal grey suit that was tailored so perfectly it made Mark's Italian suit look like a costume. He walked with a cane, not out of weakness, but as an accessory of power. The cane had a silver handle in the shape of a lion's head. The energy in the room shifted instantly. The oxygen seemed to get sucked out. Even Judge Miller sat up straighter, her eyebrows raising high. Arthur Sterling didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at Mark. His steel blue eyes locked instantly on one person. He walked straight down the center aisle, the tap, tap, tap of his cane echoing on the floor. He stopped at the defense table. He looked down at the woman in the beige cardigan. "Hello, Peanut." Arthur Sterling said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that carried to every corner of the room. Jessica looked up, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "Hi, Daddy." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence where you could hear a heart break, or in this case, a heart stop. Mark Vance's face went the color of a sheet of paper. He gripped the table so hard his knuckles turned white. He looked from the billionaire to his simple, poor wife, and his brain tried to make the connection, but the circuits were frying. "Daddy!" Jessica squeaked, her voice cracking. "Mark! Why did she call him Daddy?" Arthur Sterling slowly turned his body to face the plaintiff's table. He looked at Mark with the kind of expression a human reserves for a cockroach they are about to step on. "Mr. Henderson," Judge Miller said, her voice unusually high. It appears the defense's witness has arrived." Arthur turned to the judge. "My apologies for the tardiness, Your Honor. The traffic from the private airfield was worse than anticipated." "Mr. Sterling," Judge Miller nodded respectfully, "you are related to the defendant." "I am Arthur Sterling," he announced, placing a hand on Jessica's shoulder. "And this is my only daughter, Jessica Sterling Vance, though hopefully soon to be just Sterling again." Mark stood up, his legs shaking. This is a lie. You said your dad was a retired mechanic. You said he lived in a nursing home in Ohio." Jessica stood up slowly. She wiped her eyes and looked at Mark. The mouse was gone. In her posture, suddenly, you could see the breeding. You could see the same steel spine that her father possessed. "I said he fixed things for a living, Mark," Jessica said calmly, "and he lives in Ohio sometimes, on his estate." "But the money," Mark stammered. "We were broke. When we met, you were working at the library. You clipped coupons." Arthur Sterling laughed. It was a cold, terrifying sound. "My daughter wanted to be loved for who she was." "Not for my checkbook," Arthur said. "She wanted to find a man who would build a life with her, not a man who wanted a shortcut to the top. So we made an arrangement. She lived on a modest stipend. She tested you, Mark." Arthur took a step closer to the railing. "And you failed," Arthur said. "Spectacularly." Jessica, sensing the tide turning violently against them, tried to salvage her own dignity. "Well, so what?" "That just means she lied to you, Mark. That's fraud. She lied about her identity." Arthur's eyes snapped to Jessica. He looked at her white suit, her flashy jewelry, and then he smiled. "You must be the mistress," Arthur said. "Jessica Thorne, born in Tampa, dropped out of community college, 3 previous eviction notices, and currently driving a Mercedes leased under my company's corporate fleet account." Jessica's jaw dropped. "What?" "We'll get to that," Arthur said, turning back to the judge. "Your Honor, I am here to clarify the financial contributions. Mr. Vance claims are solely his. You see, Vance Logistics was not built by Mr. Vance's genius." Arthur motioned to Sarah Jenkins, who pulled a thick document from her box. "It was built," Arthur continued, "on an initial angel investment of $2 million, provided by a shell company called AS Holdings. Does that sound familiar, Mark?" Mark was sweating profusely now. I got that grant. It was an anonymous angel investor." "It was me," Arthur said. "Jessica asked me to help you. She believed in you, so I funded your little startup. But if you read the fine print of that investment contract, the one you signed without reading, because you were too busy buying a Porsche, you would see Clause 14B. Mr. Henderson, Mark's lawyer, was frantically flipping through his own files. He stopped. He paled. He looked at Mark with horror. "What?" Mark asked. "What is Clause 14B? "The morality and loyalty clause," Arthur said softly. "It states that the primary investor retains the right to revoke all funding and call in all debts immediately if the principal officer engages in conduct detrimental to the sanctity of the partnership or the marriage of the principal beneficiary." Arthur smiled. "The principal beneficiary is Jessica. I own your company, Mark, and since you decided to humiliate my daughter and insult her simplicity," Arthur checked his platinum watch, "I decided to call in the debt, about 10 minutes ago." The silence in the courtroom was shattered by the frantic flipping of pages. Samuel Henderson, Mark's high-priced shark of a lawyer was reading the document Arthur Sterling had placed on the table. Henderson's face, usually flushed with the confidence of a man who charges $800 an hour, was now draining of color. This is ironclad," Henderson muttered, his voice trembling slightly. He looked up at Mark, his eyes wide with professional panic. "Mark, did you sign the Series A funding agreement, dated November 12th, 2019? "I don't know." "Maybe," Mark shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "I signed 100 papers that year." "What does it matter? It's my company. I'm the CEO." "Not anymore," Arthur Sterling said calmly. He leaned heavily on his lion-head cane, looking like a king surveying a battlefield he had already won. "Under the terms of the agreement upon breach of the morality clause, all intellectual property, physical assets and liquid capital revert to the primary investor to satisfy the debt. The debt is $12 million, Mark." "Do you have $12 million? Mark stammered. My net worth is $20 million. The stock prices are speculative," Arthur corrected him, his voice dropping to a chill whisper. "I'm talking about liquid cash, but here is the problem, Mark. I just got off the phone with the board of directors. They've been informed of your breach of contract. They held an emergency vote 10 minutes ago." Mark's phone buzzed. Then it buzzed again. Then it began to vibrate incessantly against the mahogany table like a dying insect. Mark grabbed the phone. His eyes bulged. "Notifications," Mark whispered. "My access. It's being revoked. My corporate email. My bank accounts." He looked up at the judge, wild-eyed. "Your Honor, they are hacking me." "This is illegal." "It's not hacking. It's repossession," Arthur said. "You treated my daughter like an accessory you could discard because she didn't fit your new brand. You thought her simplicity was a flaw. You didn't realize that her simplicity was the only thing keeping you grounded. Without her, you're just a greedy boy in a suit he can't afford." Judge Miller, who had been watching the exchange with a mixture of shock and professional curiosity, cleared her throat. "Mr. Henderson is your client capable of paying the debt demanded by the witness." Henderson stood up slowly. He began packing his briefcase. "Mr. Henderson," the judge asked. "Your Honor," Henderson said, avoiding Mark's gaze. "My retainer agreement with Mr. Vance stipulates that if his assets are frozen or seized, representation is suspended immediately until a new payment method is secured." Mark turned to his lawyer, betrayed. "Sam, what are you doing? You can't leave me." "You're broke, Mark," Henderson said coldly, snapping his briefcase shut. "And you're up against Arthur Sterling. I'm not going to get disbarred fighting a losing battle against Sterling Global for a client who can't pay my bill. You're on your own." Henderson walked out. He didn't even look back. Jessica watched this unfold with a strange sense of detachment. For years, Mark had told her she was useless, that she didn't understand business. And yet here he was, the genius CEO, being dismantled in under 5 minutes because he never bothered to read the fine print. "Mark," Jessica said softly, her voice cut through the noise of Mark's panic. Mark looked at her, sweating. "Ellie, please, tell your dad to stop. We can work this out. I still love you." A collective gasp went through the gallery. Even the bailiff rolled his eyes. "You don't love me," Jessica said, her voice gaining strength. "You loved the idea of being superior to me. You loved having someone at home to cook your meals and clean your clothes while you went out and played the big shot with Jessica. You insulted my clothes. My simple life. That simple life is what saved your money so you could start the business in the first place. She took a breath. I cooked rice and beans so you could buy servers. I shopped at thrift stores so you could pay for patent filings, and you thanked me by bringing her here to laugh at me. Jessica pointed a shaking finger at Jessica. Jessica Thorne had been shrinking into her seat, hoping to become invisible. When Jessica pointed at her, she flinched. "Don't bring me into this," Jessica shrieked. "I didn't know Mark told me he was sole owner. He told me you were just a leech." Arthur Sterling turned his gaze toward Jessica. If his look at Mark was cold, his look at Jessica was freezing. "Miss Thorne," Arthur said pleasantly, "do you remember that comment you made earlier about my daughter looking like a cleaning lady?" Jessica swallowed hard. I was just upset. Emotions were high. "You said she belonged in a trailer park," Arthur continued. "You mocked her lack of designer clothes. It's ironic, really." Arthur pulled a single sheet of paper from his suit pocket. "Because, Miss Thorne, according to the forensic accounting my team did on Mark's company expenses, you don't actually own anything. The penthouse apartment you live in, leased by Vance Logistics. The Mercedes G-Wagon you drove to court today, leased by Vance Logistics. Even that Cartier bracelet on your wrist." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Purchased with a corporate credit card, itemized as client relations gift." Jessica clutched her wrist, covering the bracelet. "Since Vance Logistics has defaulted on its debt to AS Holdings," Arthur said, "I am now the acting owner of all company assets, and I have a policy against waste." Arthur nodded to the back of the room. One of the large security guards stepped forward. "I'm going to need the keys to the Mercedes, Miss Thorne," Arthur said, "and the bracelet, and the keys to the penthouse, effective immediately." "You can't do that," Jessica screamed, standing up. "I live there, that's my home." "It's corporate housing," Arthur corrected, "and you are not an employee. In fact, looking at the records, you've never done a day's work for the company. You're just an unauthorized expense, and I am cutting costs." Jessica looked at Mark, desperate for him to intervene. "Mark, do something. He's trying to take my car." Mark was slumped in his chair, head in his hands, staring at his frozen bank app. "I can't, Jess. He owns it all." Jessica's face twisted. The carefully curated mask of the brand ambassador fell away, revealing pure, unfiltered greed and anger. She turned on Mark instantly. "You loser!" she yelled, smacking Mark on the shoulder with her clutch. "You told me you were worth 50 million. You told me she was the dead weight. You're a fraud." "I didn't know," Mark yelled back. "I wasted 2 years on you," Jessica screamed. "I could have been with a rapper. I could have been with a hedge fund guy. You're nothing but a manager for your father-in-law." "Jessica, stop," Mark begged, humiliated. "No, I won't stop." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I want to file a suit against Mark Vance for fraud. He promised me marriage under false pretenses." Judge Miller banged her gavel, though she looked like she was struggling not to smile. "Order, Ms. Thorne. This is a divorce hearing, not a circus. Sit down, or I will have you removed." "I'm leaving," Jessica spat. She grabbed her bag and started to storm out. "Ah, Miss Thorne," Arthur called out. "The keys!" Jessica froze. The security guard was blocking the aisle, hand extended, red-faced tears of rage streaming down her cheeks. Jessica fished the keys to the Mercedes out of her bag and slammed them into the guard's hand. She unclasped the bracelet and threw it on the floor. "Keep it!" she shrieked. It was tacky anyway. She stormed out of the courtroom, her heels clicking loudly, but without the car keys. Everyone knew she was walking home or calling an Uber she probably couldn't afford. The courtroom was silent again. Mark was alone at his table. No lawyer, no mistress, no assets. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B swung shut behind Jessica Thorne, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sudden, suffocating silence. With the mistress gone, the air in the room shifted instantly. The toxic, cloying scent of her perfume began to fade, replaced by the cold, sterile smell of legal judgment. Mark Vance sat alone at the plaintiff's table. 10 minutes ago, he had been the master of his universe. He had sat there in his bespoke Italian wool suit, casually checking stock prices, confident he was about to discard his boring wife for a younger model while keeping his millions. Now he looked like a man who had woken up in a burning building only to realize he was holding the match. He looked down at his phone. It was vibrating violently against the mahogany table, glowing with a stream of notifications, scrolling past faster than he could read them. Alert. Corporate credit card, ending in 8842. Declined. Alert. Chase private client access. Revoked. Alert. Vance Logistics admin protocol. User locked out. Mark's hand shook as he reached for the device. He tapped the screen frantically. He tried to open his banking app, the one that usually showed a comforting 7-figure balance. Access denied. He tried to open his company email. Invalid credentials. He tried to open Slack to scream at his IT department. User not found. It wasn't just a firing. It was a digital execution. In 60 seconds, Mark Vance had ceased to exist in the world he prided himself on conquering. My profile, Mark whispered, looking up with eyes wide and rimmed with panic. I can't log in. They've wiped me. He looked around the room for an ally. His shark of a lawyer, Henderson, had already fled. The bailiff was staring at the ceiling, utterly uninterested. Finally, inevitably, his gaze crossed the aisle. Jessica stood there. She wasn't sitting anymore. She was standing next to her father, Arthur Sterling. The contrast was brutal. Mark was slumped, collapsing under the weight of his terror. Jessica stood with her spine straight, her chin lifted. The beige cardigan that Jessica had mocked no longer looked frumpy. Now it looked like armor. It looked like the attire of a woman who was so comfortable in her own power that she didn't need logos to prove it. Ellie, Mark choked out. The nickname slipped out instinctively. Jessica didn't flinch. She just watched him, her brown eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it looked like a physical weight, yet entirely devoid of the submission he was used to. Mark stood up, his legs feeling like jelly. He walked to the center of the room, hands held out in a pleading gesture. Ellie, please, you have to stop him. You have to tell your dad to stop. This is insane. We can fix this. Fix this, Jessica repeated. Her voice was quiet, but it silenced the room. Fix what, Mark? The mistress you brought to court. The insults, or the fact that you tried to leave me with nothing but 5 years of wasted memories. I was angry, Mark stammered, sweat dripping down his nose. I was under pressure, the board, the market. You don't know what it's like at the top. Jessica was just a distraction. She meant nothing. She meant nothing, Jessica echoed, and I suppose I meant nothing too. Mark summoned every ounce of the boyish charm that had made him a CEO. He tried to smile, that crooked, winning smile that used to make Jessica melt. You mean everything? Mark lied, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. Remember the studio apartment on 4th Street? Remember our 3rd anniversary? We were so broke, we ate that terrible cardboard pizza on the floor. You held my hand and told me that as long as we had each other, We were the richest people in the world. I remember, Jessica said softly. We can get that back. Mark pressed, sensing an opening. I'll fire Jessica. I'll delete her number. It's just us, Ellie, the dream team. Just tell your dad to unlock the accounts. We can go home, order a pizza, and talk about this. Please. For a second, Mark looked hopeful. He thought he had done it. He thought he had manipulated the simple wife one last time. Then Jessica took a step forward. The dream team, she said, testing the words like they tasted sour. That's funny, Mark. Because for the last 3 years, every interview you gave, every speech you made, you never mentioned a team. You mentioned you. Mark's smile faltered. You erased me, Jessica said, her voice rising. You told the world I was a burden. You told your friends I was lazy. You told Jessica I was just a mouse in a room full of lions. She pointed a finger at him, her hand shaking with rage. Who stayed up until 4:00 a.m., coding the dispatch algorithm when the servers crashed in 2021. You didn't know the code, Mark. I did. Who fired the corrupt shipping manager who was stealing from us. You were too scared to do it. I did. And who sat in that apartment eating rice and beans, wearing clothes from Goodwill, and saving every single penny so you could buy your first suit? Jessica Aitono. I did, she shouted. I built the foundation you stood on. You stood on my shoulders and told the world you were flying. Mark recoiled. He had no defense. The narrative he had built that he was the genius and she was the anchor was crumbling. Arthur Sterling stepped forward. The sound of his cane tapping against the floor was rhythmic, heavy, and final. You have a selective memory, Mark, Arthur rumbled. You remember the pizza, but do you remember the Series A funding meeting? You came to my office shaking. You needed $2 million. Jessica begged me to take the meeting. She vouched for your integrity. Arthur laughed, a cold, dry sound. I didn't invest in your business plan, Mark. I invested in my daughter's judgment, and that is why I included Clause 14b. Arthur motioned to Sarah Jenkins, who handed him a thick black file. He dropped it onto the table with a heavy thud. Forensic accounting, Arthur said. My team has been inside your servers for 45 minutes. Do you know what we found? Mark was hyperventilating. It's standard corporate spending. Is a $70,000 lease on a penthouse for Miss Thorne standard? Arthur asked, flipping the file open. Is a diamond bracelet listed as office supplies standard? How about the first-class trips to Cabo San Lucas billed as logistics scouting? Arthur leaned in his face, inches from Mark's. That isn't mismanagement, Mark. That is embezzlement. That is wire fraud. And since I am the majority shareholder, you were stealing from me. Mark gripped the table. The room spun. Prison. He wasn't just losing his job. He was looking at steel bars. I can pay it back, Mark whispered, tears flowing freely. I'll work. I'll do anything. You can't pay it back, Arthur stated flatly. Because you have nothing. You are currently negative $12 million in debt to Sterling Global. Mark looked at Jessica, sobbing. Ellie, help me. Please, I don't want to go to jail. Jessica looked at the man she had once adored. She saw the tears, the terror. 10 years ago, she would have rushed to fix it. But this wasn't her husband. This was a stranger who had worn her husband's face to steal her father's money. Daddy, Jessica said softly. Let him go. Mark's head snapped up. What? I don't want him in prison. Jessica said, her voice tired. "I don't want to testify. I don't want to see his face in the news. I just want him gone." Arthur nodded slowly. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a single white envelope and a pen. "Here is the deal," Arthur said. "Option A. I hand this file to the district attorney. You will be arrested before you leave the building and likely serve 5 years. Mark shuddered. Option B. You sign the divorce papers right now, uncontested. You admit to adultery. You resign as CEO. And you disappear. "I'll sign," Mark said, instantly grabbing the pen. "I'll sign it all." "Wait," Arthur said. "You must accept a severance package." Mark paused. Severance. Maybe there was $1 million in go-away money. Maybe he could still survive this. "How much?" "Open the envelope." Mark tore it open. He pulled out a cashier's check. He stared at the number blinking. $10,000. Mark looked up, pale. "This is a joke. The company is worth $80 million. Your equity is 0, Arthur snapped. That $10,000 is a gift from Jessica. It is enough for a deposit on a cheap apartment and a suit for interviews. It is exactly $10,000 more than you were planning to give her an hour ago." "But I can't live on this," Mark whined. "My condo lease." "Locks changed 10 minutes ago." Arthur cut him off. "Your personal items are in a box at the front desk. The car has been repossessed." Mark looked at Jessica one last time. "Ellie, 10,000. That's nothing." "It's a lot to a simple person," Jessica said quietly. "It's enough to start over if you're willing to work. That's how we started. Take the money, Mark. Go eat pizza on the floor. Find out who you really are when the money is gone." Mark looked at the check, then at Arthur's granite face. He realized he had no moves left. The game was over. He signed the divorce decree with a shaking hand. He signed the resignation. "I signed," Mark whispered. "Can I go?" "One last thing," Judge Miller interrupted from the bench. "Mr. Vance. I am granting the divorce immediately, but hear me clearly. If you approach Mrs. Sterling or any Sterling Global property, I will have you arrested. Do not test me." "Yes, Your Honor," Mark whispered. He grabbed the check, the pathetic remnant of his empire. He turned around. The walk to the door felt like muzzles. He passed the empty seats where his sycophants used to sit. He passed the spot where Jessica had thrown her bracelet. He felt the eyes of everyone in the room boring into him, not with envy but with pity. He pushed open the heavy doors and stepped into the hallway. The air was stale. He was alone. No entourage, no lawyer, no wife, no mistress. Mark Vance looked at the check in his hand. One last time. $10,000. The price of his soul. He buttoned his jacket, trying to cling to some shred of dignity, and walked toward the elevator, a beggar in a $3,000 suit. The heavy thud of the courtroom doors closing behind Mark Vance felt like the period at the end of a long, painful sentence. For a moment, no one moved. The air in courtroom 4B, which had been thick with tension and the scent of cheap cologne and expensive perfume, suddenly felt breathable again. Judge Harriet Miller slowly removed her reading glasses, folding them with a deliberate click. She looked down from the bench, her stern expression softening for the first time that morning. She looked at the woman in the beige cardigan, who was still standing tall next to her billionaire father. "Mrs. Sterling," Judge Miller said, making a point to correct the name on the record herself. "In 20 years on this bench, I have presided over thousands of divorces. I have seen screaming matches thrown, shoes, and endless greed, but I have never seen a display of dignity quite like that. The judge leaned forward slightly. You are free to go, ma'am, and good luck. Thank you, Your Honor, Jessica said, her voice clear and steady. Sarah Jenkins, the court-appointed lawyer who had started the day looking exhausted and defeated, was now beaming as she packed her files. She looked 10 years younger. She snapped her briefcase shut with a newfound energy. Mr. Sterling, Sarah said, extending a hand to Arthur. It was a terrifying pleasure watching you work. And Jessica, I'm sorry I doubted the strategy. I thought we were walking into a slaughter. We were. Jessica smiled, smoothing the fabric of her wool sleeve. Just not ours. You did your job, Sarah, Arthur said, shaking her hand firmly. Expect a bonus in your firm's account by the end of the business day. I appreciate loyalty. As the legal team dispersed, Arthur Sterling turned to his daughter. He leaned heavily on his lion head cane, studying her face. Well, Peanut, he grumbled affectionately. It's done. The trash has been taken out. The parasites are gone. Now we have the headache of the cleanup. Arthur sighed, looking at his watch. I'll have my team draft the liquidation papers this afternoon. The brand is toxic now. Mark's name is plastered all over it. We can probably sell the assets for parts, trucks, warehouses, the server farms. We might recoup 60 cents on the dollar if we move fast. Jessica walked over to the large window that looked out over the grey, rain-slicked Seattle skyline. She stared at the city for a long moment. Don't sell it, Daddy, she said softly. Arthur raised a silver eyebrow. Oh, why not? It's a sinking ship, Elle. Mark didn't just run it into an iceberg. He set the iceberg on fire. The name is toxic, Jessica admitted, turning back to face him. But the infrastructure isn't. The bones are good. And more importantly, the people are good. She walked back toward him, her eyes flashing with a sudden intensity. Mark thought Vance Logistics was about the software and the branding. He thought it was about his face on the magazine covers. But it was always about the people in the warehouse. There are 200 employees in that building, Dad. I know their names. I know that Mrs. Higgins in dispatch just had a grandbaby she's trying to support. I know that Dave in shipping is working double shifts to pay off his student loans. If we liquidate, they lose everything. Arthur stared at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had built his own empire 40 years ago. Mark didn't care about them, Jessica said. But I do. I built the back-end systems. I know where every dollar goes. I don't need an MBA or a fancy suit to know how to run that company. I just need the chance to do it right. And who is going to run this new company? Arthur asked, a slow smile spreading across his face. I am, Jessica said. I'm going to rebrand it. I'm going to strip his name off the building by tomorrow morning. And I'm going to run it with the one thing Mark never understood. Which is simplicity, Jessica said. Honest work, honest pay, no drama. Arthur chuckled, a sound of pure pride. Very well. Sterling Logistics has a nice ring to it. The keys are yours. CEO Sterling. 24 hours later. The rain was pouring down on the industrial park the next morning, but the atmosphere inside the headquarters of what was formerly Vance Logistics was electric. A team of contractors was already outside, drilling into the brick facade. With a loud screech of metal, the giant illuminated V came crashing down onto the pavement, followed by the rest of Mark's name. It was tossed into a dumpster, shattered. Inside, the entire staff had been gathered in the main warehouse floor. They were terrified. Rumors had been flying all night. Mark was fired. The company was bankrupt. Everyone was losing their jobs. Then Jessica walked in. She wasn't wearing a designer power suit. She wasn't wearing the beige cardigan either. She was wearing a crisp white shirt, black slacks, and sensible work boots. She walked up to the microphone, standing on a shipping pallet so she could be seen. "Good morning," she said. Her voice echoed through the silent warehouse. "My name is Jessica Sterling. Most of you know me as the woman who used to bring cookies to the break room. Some of you know me as the person who fixed the server crashes." She paused, looking at the sea of anxious faces. "You've heard rumors. They are true. Mark Vance is no longer with the company. The company as you knew it is gone." A collective gasp went through the crowd. People began to whisper, panic setting in. "However," Jessica raised her voice, "we are not closing. We are evolving. Effective immediately. This is Sterling Logistics. No one is losing their job today. In fact, the money that was being siphoned off for executive perks, the private jets, the luxury cars, the penthouse apartments, is being redirected." She pulled a piece of paper from her pocket. "Starting today, every hourly employee is receiving a 15% raise, and we are implementing a full profit-sharing pension plan." The silence held for 1 second, and then the warehouse erupted. Cheers, applause, and tears of relief filled the cavernous space. Jessica didn't smile triumphantly. She just nodded, rolled up her sleeves, and stepped down from the pallet. "Now," she said to the nearest shift manager, "let's get those trucks moving. We have customers waiting." 6 months later. The winter in Seattle was brutal that year. The wind cut through layers of clothing like a knife, and the rain was relentless. In a cramped basement-level studio apartment in the south end of the city, Mark Vance sat on a futon that smelled faintly of mildew and cat urine, though he didn't own a cat. The apartment was smaller than the walk-in closet in his old penthouse. He wasn't a CEO anymore. He wasn't even a manager. After the news of the Sterling courtroom massacre hit the business blogs, Mark became radioactive. Headhunters hung up on him. Old friends blocked his number. The $10,000 Arthur had given him had vanished in 2 months, eaten up by first and last rent debt collectors and legal fees for the audit. He tried to fight and lost. Now Mark worked the graveyard shift at a fulfillment center for a rival shipping company, a massive, soulless corporation that treated humans like robots. He spent 10 hours a night lifting 50-pound crates of frozen fish. His back screamed in agony every time he moved. His hands, once manicured and soft, were blistered and cracked. He sat hunched over a laptop he had bought at a pawn shop, eating a cup of instant noodles for dinner. A news alert popped up in the corner of his screen. Business Insider. Jessica Sterling named Entrepreneur of the Year. How she turned a failing logistics firm into a gold mine. Mark's hand shook as he clicked the link. There she was. Jessica. She looked breathtaking. She was standing in the warehouse, surrounded by smiling employees. She wore a sharp, emerald-green blazer, simple, elegant, professional. She looked radiant. She looked powerful. She looked happy. The article detailed how she had saved the company, increased efficiency by 200%, and created a workplace culture that was the envy of the industry. It mentioned her philosophy. Success isn't about complexity or flash. It's about simplicity and integrity. Mark closed the laptop. He stared at his reflection in the dark screen. Hollow eyes, grey skin. A man who had traded a diamond for a handful of dust. He looked around his tiny, cold room. He had wanted to be a king. Now he was just a ghost. Across town, the karma was hitting Jessica Thorne just as hard, but in a different way. It was Friday night. Jessica stood outside the Velvet Rope, the city's most exclusive nightclub. She was dressed in a knockoff designer dress she had bought online, shivering in the freezing drizzle. She was trying to talk her way past the Velvet Rope, flashing a smile that was becoming increasingly desperate. "Do you know who I am?" Jessica demanded, tossing her wet blonde hair. "I used to be on the VIP list. I know the promoter, the bouncer." A mountain of a man with a clipboard looked down at her. He didn't blink. "I know exactly who you are," he said flatly. "You're the girl from the Vance trial. The Mercedes girl." Jessica flinched. The nickname had stuck like tar. The video of her handing over the keys to the security guard had gone viral. Memes of her face twisted in anger were still circulating on TikTok. She wasn't an influencer anymore. She was a punchline. "That was a misunderstanding." Jessica pleaded, her mascara starting to run. "Look, just let me in. My friends are inside. I can pay the cover." "Your friends aren't here," the bouncer said, crossing his arms. "And your money is no good here. Mr. Sterling owns this building too, and the owner's instructions are very specific." He leaned down, his voice low and humiliating. "No trash allowed." He unhooked the rope, but not for her. He ushered in a group of laughing, well-dressed women standing behind her. Jessica stood there in the rain, the bass of the music thumping through the walls, realizing that the high society she had tried so desperately to sleep her way into had slammed its doors in her face forever. She turned and walked away, her high heels clicking unevenly on the wet pavement alone. High above the city in the corner office of Sterling Logistics, the view was breathtaking. The Space Needle pierced the clouds, glowing gold against the night sky. The office didn't look like Mark's old office. The expensive, uncomfortable modern art was gone. The wet bar was gone. In its place were whiteboards covered in diagrams, photos of staff events, and a simple, sturdy oak desk. Jessica sat at the desk, reviewing the quarterly projections. The numbers were staggering. They were up 40% over Mark's best year. Her phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from her father. "Dad, dinner at the house on Sunday. I'm making the roast. Also, the stock price just jumped another 12%. Proud of you, Peanut." Jessica smiled, typing back a quick, "Yes." She put the phone down and looked at the only personal item on her desk. It wasn't a trophy. It wasn't an award. It was a framed photograph of her and Mark, taken 10 years ago, eating pizza on the floor of their first apartment. For a long time, she had kept it face down. But today, she stood it up. She didn't look at it with anger anymore. She looked at it as a reminder of where she came from, a reminder that money doesn't make the man character does. Mark had forgotten the lesson of that simple pizza, and it cost him everything. Jessica had remembered, and it gave her the world. She picked up her pen, a simple, reliable ballpoint, and turned back to her paperwork. The warehouse below was humming with life, a symphony of industry and honest work. Jessica Sterling took a deep breath, feeling the peace of a life well earned. She had an empire to run, and she was going to do it. Simply. And that is the brutal, beautiful truth about karma. Mark and Jessica thought they could win by playing dirty, by judging Jessica based on her cardigan and her quiet nature. They mistook simplicity for stupidity. But they forgot that the tallest trees have the deepest roots. While they were busy showing off, Jessica was busy holding everything together. It's a lesson for all of us. Never let someone else's arrogance make you doubt your own worth. And never ever assume that the person sitting quietly in the corner doesn't hold the keys to the kingdom. So I have to ask you guys, do you think the punishment fit the crime? Did Mark deserve to lose absolutely everything, or was the humiliation enough? And what about Jessica? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you liked this story of justice served ice cold, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We drop new stories every week, and trust me, the next one is even crazier. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.